Welcome to our daily reflection for this Sunday, February 4th. And of course, every Sunday is the Lord's Day, the day of the resurrection. It's a day of joy, of rest in the Lord, peace, prayer, praise, and gratefulness, because we celebrate that Jesus was victorious over death, and that gives us hope. And that relates exactly to, ironically, our first reading from the book of Job, because Job doesn't know that there is hope beyond death. He hasn't had the gospel preached to him, and so we're going to hear about the gospel and needing to go out in the gospel reading today. But let's just start with Job, because it might seem a bit off-putting. Job talks about, isn't man's life on earth drudgery? He longs as he works in the sun for the shade. The worker toils and he longs to get his wages. And then he talks about ailment and sickness. And of course, we know at this point in Job's own story, he is suffering greatly. And so he talks about the long nights of suffering and not being able to sleep. And if people understand chronic pain or chronic illness, how the agony of not being able to sleep and rest night after night, day after day, that is torture. And it's so hard to endure that. Now, Job endures all that, especially the idea of illness, where there's no sense of rest, and working in the world without much rest and leisure, that labor and suffering without consolation and reprieve seems so burdensome. And so Job gives this complaint to God. And what we find then is, then you go to Psalm 147, the responsorial psalm, and it's like whiplash, praising God for his mercy and his goodness, and wait a minute, how do we go from lament to praise, from pain to praise? And then the psalm talks about how God heals up the brokenhearted and he binds up their wounds. And so God is a healer, and that's why the psalmist praises him. So we go from the sickness of Job to the psalmist recounting that God is a healer, to then the second reading, which Paul talks about the need, the compulsion to preach the good news to everyone, and how he makes himself a slave to all in order to save some, at least. And so the importance of proclaiming the good news. And then we get to the gospel, and this is where things kind of come together. Because Jesus is at Peter's house early in his ministry at Capernaum. And Simon's mother-in-law is ill with a fever, and Jesus heals her. And what we see here is exactly the fulfillment of the psalm. God is a healer, and he heals Simon's mother-in-law. And Jesus then goes out to proclaim the good news. And then everybody in town brings at sunset all who are sick and ill or demon-possessed. They bring to Jesus. In other words, they're bringing to God for healing. And what we see is what Job couldn't see, that God is a healer, and that when the Messiah comes, he's going to heal and bring a cure. And that ultimately that's what God is going to do. And of course, the good news of the gospel is that God has taken on human nature. He has suffered, he has died, and by doing so, he's brought about a cure for even death itself. And that's what gives us hope, the hope that Job couldn't yet see, because he was way before the coming death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so you might ask, well, how does the church put these readings together of Job's complaint, Job's lament, and you go from the lament to the loud and praise of the psalmist and then of the gospel here. And Jesus then, gets up early in the morning and he tells Peter, as he says, everyone is looking for you, Peter says, and that's prophetically true. Everybody, whether they know it or not, is looking for the cure. They're looking for God. And Jesus is the answer to that prayer that everyone has. And that's why we, like Paul, have to be at pains to make the gospel, the good news, known, because everybody in the world is looking for a solution to their unhappiness, to their suffering, to their loneliness, to their misery, to their pains and labors. And there is an answer, and that answer is Jesus Christ. So let's reflect on how Jesus is the answer to all of our lamenting and all of our pains. And if we can give that good news to those who are suffering, we can console them with the hope of Jesus Christ. Let's share that hope. Let's reflect on that hope today. May the Lord bless and keep you.
This daily reflection is brought to you thanks to the generous support of the Mission Circle. Join the Mission Circle to help Catholics worldwide understand, live, and share their faith. Sign up at missioncircle.org today.